The smell came before the trucks did. It always came first, that thick, fermented sweetness riding the early morning air, like something between molasses and rot, the kind of smell that settled into your hair and the inside of your nose and refused to leave for the rest of the day. Clara Bowen had learned over the course of 2 years to read the smell the way her grandfather had once read the sky before rain, the heaviness of it, the direction it came from, whether it carried the sharper edge of fresh dumping or the older, flatter sourness of what had already been sitting in the heat for days. She was standing on the back porch when the first truck appeared at the far end of the south field, its headlights cutting pale yellow lines through the August morning mist. She didn't move, she didn't call out. She reached into the front pocket of her canvas work apron and pulled out a small notebook, spiral-bound, the cover soft and warped from weeks of sweat and morning dew, and she made a mark. 6 lines on the page, 6 trucks this week. She did the arithmetic in her head the way she always did, multiplying the load estimates she had counted against the number of trips, working the numbers until she had something close to a total. She wrote it at the bottom of the column, 2,200 tons. Estimated. She was 16 years old. Her boots were taped at the left toe where the seam had split in June. Her hands were already rough from the morning's chores, knuckles dried out by the work and the heat both. She stood on that porch, the way a person stands when they have been standing in the same place for a long time, not quite still, not quite at rest, but settled into it, accustomed to it, the way you get used to a pain that doesn't kill you and doesn't leave. What nobody knew, not her father, not her mother, not the man at the county clerk's office with the folder that had never been opened twice, was that the notebook in Clara's apron pocket was not new. There were 6 others like it, stored under her bed in an old boot box, each one filled with the same careful columns: dates, truck counts, load estimates, wind direction noted in the corner of the page, because she had figured out early that the smell traveled differently depending on which way the air was moving, and that, on the worst mornings when the wind came from the southeast, it reached the kitchen by 5:30, and her mother would close the window without saying anything about it. 8 months of records. Every morning she could manage, and some mornings she could not, because the cows needed earlier attention, or the fence line had broken again and her father needed the help before first light. But 8 months of marks in 7 notebooks stacked under her bed, alongside a pair of winter boots and a broken flashlight she kept meaning to fix. She had not started the notebooks with any plan in mind. She could not have explained if anyone had asked exactly why she began. It was not strategy. It was not evidence gathering in any legal sense, though the word evidence would come to her later in a different light, in a different season. It was something closer to the need to make a mark when the world is doing something to you and there is nothing else you can do. Something that said, I am watching, I am counting, this is real, and I am recording that it is real even if no one else will. The first truck reached the far corner of the south field and began to back up toward the low ground her grandfather had called the good bottom. Clara watched without blinking. The tailgate swung open. The load came down with a sound she no longer registered as sound. It had become something more like weather, part of the background of the day, the way thunder becomes unremarkable to people who have lived through enough storms. The driver did not look at the house. They never did. The Bowen farm sat on 80 acres of soft, rolling ground in a part of Louisiana where the cane fields had once been the source of everything, the economy, the seasons, the shape of the year. The land had been in the family for 3 generations. Clara's grandfather, Earl Bowen, had worked it for 41 years and built it into something that the older men in the county remembered with the particular reverence people save for things that are gone. Earl had known the soil the way a doctor knows a patient, intimately, specifically by its history and its tendencies and its secret strengths. He knew which corner of the east field drained poorly in March and needed to be left alone. He knew that the bottom land near the south fence held moisture longer than anywhere else on the property and would give you corn a full 2 weeks ahead of anything else in the county if you planted it right and let it do what it wanted to do. He used to say the bottom ground was so rich you could push a fence post in by hand on a Monday and watch a sprout climb it by Sunday. Clara had grown up hearing this the way other children grew up hearing fairy tales. She had believed it the way children believe fairy tales, completely and then less completely, and then not at all. Earl Bowen had died in the winter of 2007, 2 years before the company arrived. Clara had been 8 years old. She remembered him mostly in the specific way children remember grandparents, as a smell, as a pair of large hands, as a voice saying something she could not quite bring back to complete words. She remembered sitting beside him on the porch steps while he told her things about the soil that she had not understood at the time, things about what made land good, things about patience, things about how the earth remembered what you put into it and gave it back in time. What she understood now at 16, sitting with those memories and looking at what had happened to the bottom ground, was that the earth remembered everything you put into it, good and bad alike. The Meridian Cane Processing Company had come to the county in the early 2000s, part of a quiet expansion of the regional sugar industry that had been happening in pieces for a decade. They had bought land to the west and south of several small farms, built a processing facility that was larger than anything the county had seen, and brought with them the particular kind of promise that industrial operations always bring to rural places: jobs, economic activity, the sense that something significant was happening. People had been grateful. Some people still were. The problems had started in 2009 when the expansion of the processing facility created more byproduct than the company had originally planned for. That was the word they used in the early communications: byproduct. Sugarcane bagasse, the crushed fiber left behind after the juice is pressed out, had been piling up at the facility at a rate that exceeded their current disposal capacity, and the Bowen farm, as it happened, sat downwind downhill and conveniently adjacent to land the company had recently acquired. A man in a tucked-in shirt had arrived at the Bowen farm in the autumn of 2009. He had been polite. He had used the word temporary a great deal. He had explained in the careful language of someone who has been trained to explain things in careful language that the company needed to use a portion of the adjacent land for material storage on a temporary basis, that compensation had been discussed and would be addressed, that the arrangement was expected to last no more than one processing season. Clara had been 10 years old. She had been in the kitchen doing homework and had heard the conversation through the screen door without understanding most of it. What she understood was the sound of her father's voice, the careful, deliberate sound of a man choosing his words because he is talking to someone with more power than he has. That sound she had understood even at 10. What temporary came to mean in practice was 6 years. The piles grew. First in the far corner of the south field, where the ground was lowest and the drainage ran away from the main acreage, then in a wider arc spreading as the volume increased, as the trucks became a daily presence rather than an occasional one. The bagasse itself was not by any measure a benign material in its raw form. Acidic, nitrogen-starved, slow to break down, it leached into the soil beneath it and altered the drainage patterns of the surrounding ground. The bottom land, which had once grown sweet corn waist-high by the 4th of July, began to produce thin yellowing stalks that snapped in the wind and gave almost nothing worth harvesting. The grass along the fence line turned the color of weak tea. The drainage ditch filled with a dark residue that sat in the low spots after rain and smelled in the heat like something between vinegar and decay. The well water had developed a faint sourness by the second year. Clara's mother, June, had started buying jugs of water from the feed store in town and had not said a single word about why. Walt Bowen had written letters, 14 of them by Clara's count, though she had come to know this number not because her father had told her, but because she had found the letters herself one afternoon in her 15th year in a shoebox under her parents' bed that she had been looking in for a pair of work gloves. She had sat on the floor of her parents' bedroom for 40 minutes reading them. They were good letters, careful, well-reasoned, specific about the damage and its timeline, measured in tone, but clear about what was being asked. They cited the relevant county regulations. They named dates and described changes to the soil and the water with the kind of precision that a person develops when they have been watching damage accumulate for years and have been waiting for the moment when it might matter to say exactly how it accumulated. They were the letters of a man who had spent his whole life being reasonable and believed, or had once believed, that reasonableness was something the world rewarded. What Clara noticed sitting on that floor was that all 14 letters were still in the box. None of them had been sent. She put them back exactly as she had found them, refastened the lid, and pushed the box back under the bed. She found the work gloves in the mudroom where they had always been. She went back to work and did not say anything about what she had found, not that evening, not ever. But she thought about those 14 letters for a long time afterward. She thought about the kind of silence they represented, not the silence of a man who had given up, but the silence of a man who had run the calculation and understood that the math did not work out in his favor. Walt Bowen had gone to the Meridian Cane Processing Company's local office on 3 separate occasions. Clara knew this because she had been home for the first 2 and had watched him prepare washing up, changing into his good shirt, driving out with the set expression of a man going to do something unpleasant that he had convinced himself was necessary. The first time he came home angry, the particular quiet anger of a person who has been spoken to in a way that made clear the speaking didn't really matter. He ate dinner without conversation and went to bed early. The second time he came home quieter, which was worse. He sat on the porch until it was full dark and then came inside and sat at the kitchen table for a while without doing anything and then went to bed. June had not asked him about either visit. Some things in a family accumulate their own silence, the way the dump site was accumulating its own weight, and the silence around Walt's visits to the company office was one of those things. The third visit was different because Clara followed him. She hadn't planned to. She had been in the equipment shed when she saw his truck pull out of the yard, and something the particular angle of his shoulders as he drove some quality of the morning that she registered without naming made her put down what she was doing and get into her own vehicle and follow at enough distance that he wouldn't see her in the rearview mirror. She parked on the street outside the Meridian office and went around to the side of the building where a row of old shrubs grew close to the foundation. The window of the main office was old and single pane, and the latch didn't quite close all the way, which she discovered because the window was open by 2 inches on a warm September morning, and she could hear everything. The man on the other side of the desk was named Leland Greer. She had heard the name before. Her father had mentioned it. Her mother had mentioned it, but she had never seen him. He was in his late 50s, she estimated, with the bearing of a man who has spent several decades occupying a position of moderate authority in a place where moderate authority goes mostly unchallenged. He was not unkind. That was the thing that stayed with her most. He was not cruel. He was not dismissive in any theatrical way. He offered her father coffee, which her father accepted. He spoke in the measured tones of a man who had learned that reasonable-sounding speech is a form of protection. He talked about regulatory timelines. He talked about operational realities. He talked about the timeline for the new processing facility coming online, using the phrase coming online, the way the first man in the tucked-in shirt had used the word temporary with a kind of fluency that suggested these words had been chosen for their ability to mean several different things at once, without committing to any of them. And then he reached into the drawer of his desk and placed a binder on the surface between them. It was navy blue thick, the kind of binder that contains documents that have been prepared by people who are paid specifically to prepare documents like this. He slid it across the desk without making a production of it, without any visible menace, the way you might pass someone the salt at dinner. "Mr. Bowen," he said, "I want you to understand that we take your concerns seriously. If you feel that litigation is the appropriate path, that is absolutely your right. This is what that path looks like in terms of timeline and scope." Clara watched her father open the binder. She watched him turn a page, then another. She watched the back of his neck, which was the only part of him she could see clearly from her position outside the window. She watched something go through him that she recognized not as defeat exactly, but as the particular reckoning that comes when a person who has been running on faith encounters the actual arithmetic. Walt closed the binder. He stood. He reached across the desk and shook Leland Greer's hand. He said, "Thank you for your time." He said it the way a man says something when the saying of it is the only dignity left available to him. He walked out. Clara stayed by the window long enough to watch Leland Greer turn back to his desk and pick up a different file from the stack beside him. He did not watch Walt leave. The door had barely finished closing before his attention was somewhere else entirely. She drove home a different way than her father and got back to the farm before him. She was in the kitchen when he came in. He walked past her, went to the sink, washed his hands for longer than they needed washing, and then went to the bedroom and closed the door. June was hanging laundry on the line and hadn't seen him come in. Clara stood at the kitchen counter and looked at the closed bedroom door and understood something that the 14 letters in the shoebox and the 2 previous visits had been building toward. No one was coming. She had known it before, in the imprecise way you know things that are too large and too heavy to look at directly. But standing in that kitchen with the smell of the dump site coming through the window screen and her father behind a closed door and her mother's shadow moving across the grass outside, she knew it with the particular clarity of something seen close up. No one was coming, which meant that whatever happened next was going to have to start here on this farm with what was available on this farm. She didn't know yet what that meant. She was 16 years old and she didn't have a plan and she didn't have a solution. She just had the knowing sitting in her chest like a stone that had been there a long time and had finally found its proper place. The community had its own relationship with the situation, which was to say it had the relationship of people who are close enough to a problem to feel it, but not close enough to own it. Cormac Vass, who farmed the 60 acres across the road, worked 3 days a week at the Meridian facility during the slower months. He had a daughter in college and a tractor that needed a new engine, and the arithmetic of his own life didn't leave much room for someone else's trouble. He was not a bad man. He was a man with a specific set of pressures who had made the calculation that most people make when their own survival is in contention. Clara's mother had tried once to raise the subject at the Catcher's Feed and Supply in town. In the particular indirect way women of her generation approached difficult things, circling it, offering an opening, waiting to see if anyone would walk through with her. A woman named Patricia Rourke, who had known the Bowen family for 30 years and had been to Earl's funeral and brought a casserole afterward, looked at the floor and said, "Honey, that's just how things are now." Then she had gone back to looking at the seed display. Clara had been there. She had been standing by the door pretending to read the bulletin board. She heard Patricia Rourke's voice and she heard what was underneath the voice. Not cruelty, not indifference, but something more defeated than either of those things. A surrender so complete it had stopped feeling like surrender and started feeling like wisdom. That sentence, "That's just how things are now," lodged in Clara's mind in a place that sentences go when they are the kind of sentences you are going to be answering for the rest of your life one way or another. She thought about it driving home. She thought about it doing the evening chores. She thought about it in bed, in the specific wide-awake dark of a person who has received information they cannot put down. There was one teacher at the county school who had not made her feel like she was watching something inevitable from a safe distance. Mr. Gaines taught agriculture and land management and had grown up on a dairy farm 2 counties over, a fact he mentioned rarely, and only in context where it was relevant in some practical sense. He was 57 years old, gray at the temples, with the hands of someone who had done physical work for most of his life and had not tried to disguise this. He taught with the specific authority of a person who has personal knowledge of what he is describing, which is a different kind of authority than the kind that comes from books, and Clara had recognized it from the first week of class. She had always paid attention in his class, but it was one particular afternoon in September, the second week of September, still warm, the windows open, when he talked about the relationship between organic matter and soil biology, about the way living soil functions as an ecosystem rather than a substrate, that she felt something she would later recognize as her first real question about the problem she was living inside of. Not a general question, a specific one beginning to form. She didn't have words for it yet, but it started then in that classroom while Mr. Gaines talked about the relationship between what goes into the earth and what comes back out. 3 weeks later, on a warm Saturday afternoon in late September, Clara was walking the south fence line, looking for breaks in the wire when she stopped. She stopped because something in the far corner of the oldest section of the dump site, the area that the trucks had abandoned years ago in favor of fresher ground, the section that had been sitting undisturbed through several seasons of rain and sun and freeze and thaw, had caught her eye. The pile in that corner had long since collapsed in on itself, flattened by time and weather, spread across the ground by the slow patience of rain. Grass had crept back across the edges, the particular scrubby grass that grows in disturbed ground, yellow-green and thin. A crow was working the far side of a depression in the middle of the spread. Everything in that corner of the field looked the way it had looked for years, dead in the specific, exhausted way of ground that has been poisoned and then abandoned, except for one thing. On the south side of the old pile, half hidden under a curl of decomposing bagasse fiber that had dried into something like papier-mâché, a tomato plant was growing. Clara had seen volunteer plants before seed that had blown in or been carried by a bird and taken root in unlikely places. They were usually spindly, struggling things, growing with the apologetic thinness of something that knows it is in the wrong place. This was not that. This plant was dark-leaved and thick stems, standing at least a foot taller than any tomato in her mother's garden. It was hung with fruit, heavy round fruit that had bent the main stems into a bow, the way you see in pictures of productive gardens, in photographs of the kind of growing that people who love growing find beautiful. Not 1 or 2 tomatoes, dozens. Nothing else grew in that section of the field. The soil around the plant was dark and bare, in a ring where the runoff from the old pile had settled, and in that dark bare ring nothing had taken hold except this one plant which had taken hold completely. Clara stood there for a long time. She stood there long enough for the afternoon light to shift, for the crow to finish what it was doing and fly off, for the air to cool by a degree or two in the way that September air cools in the last hour before evening. She stood there long enough for the arithmetic of what she was looking at to begin to work itself out in some part of her mind that was moving faster than the part that was just standing in a field looking at a tomato plant. Something had happened in that soil, something about the years of weather working on the old material, something about decomposition and time had produced conditions in which this plant had not just survived, but thrived, had produced something that the surrounding ground, the ground that had been farther from the pile, had not been able to produce in years. She reached out and touched one of the tomatoes. It was warm from the afternoon sun and firm and absolutely real. She walked home before dark, ate dinner without saying anything. Unusual helped her mother with the dishes, did the evening check on the animals. She went to bed at the regular time. She did not sleep for a long time. When she did sleep, she dreamed of the soil under that plant, dark and soft, giving under the weight of everything growing in it. In the dream, she could see into it, see the roots running through it in a complicated branching system, and she had the specific feeling that certain dreams give you of being on the edge of understanding something important. In the morning, she got up before first light and went to the equipment shed and found a clean spiral notebook on the shelf where she kept her supplies. She sat down at the workbench and opened to the first page. She thought for a moment about what to write. Then she wrote one sentence. Why is it growing there? She looked at it for a while. Then she put the notebook in her apron pocket next to the one with the truck counts and went out to start the morning chores. The smell was already in the air. The trucks would come again today as they came every day. The black mountain behind the south fence would grow by another measure, another column's worth of marks in her record. But something had shifted in the specific quiet way that things shift before anyone around them knows to look. Something in the ground and something in the girl standing next to it had begun a process that would take years to become visible and would change by the end of it more than one kind of landscape. She didn't know that yet. She just had the question. And for the first time in a long time, a question felt like something other than helplessness. It felt like the beginning of work. The library in Ketcher County was a single-story building on the corner of Marsh and Callaway Streets, the kind of small-town library that exists in the particular quiet of institutions that have outlasted the optimism that built them. The carpet was the color of old moss. The fluorescent lights buzzed at a frequency that was just below the threshold of annoyance. The shelves were organized with a precision that suggested someone cared deeply about order in a place where not many people came anymore to be ordered. Mrs. Aldrich had been the head librarian for 22 years. She was a small woman in her mid-60s with reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck and the particular stillness of someone who has spent a career in a place where stillness is the professional standard. She did not ask questions when people came in. She watched and she listened and she paid attention in the way that people who work with information learn to pay attention, not intrusively, but completely. Clara came in on a Tuesday afternoon in the first week of October, 3 days after she had stood in the south field looking at the tomato plant. She had been turning the question over for 3 days, the way you turn something hard and unfamiliar in your hand, looking for the angle that makes it make sense. She had gone through what she knew, which was not much. She knew the plant was growing in ground that had been covered by the old pile for years. She knew nothing else in that section of the field was growing. She knew the soil under the plant had looked different from the surrounding ground, darker, looser, more alive, in some quality she didn't have the language for yet. She walked to the reference section and stood in front of the shelves for a moment, not quite knowing where to start. Mrs. Aldrich appeared beside her without making any particular sound of approach. "Is there something specific you're looking for?" she asked, not with curiosity exactly, with the professional interest of someone whose job is to connect people with what they need. "Composting," Clara said. "And soil science, I think. Agricultural." She paused. "I don't know exactly what I need." Mrs. Aldrich looked at her for a moment over the reading glasses. Then she turned to the shelves and began pulling books. She brought 3 that afternoon. By the end of the week, she had brought 4 more. By the second week, she had begun setting aside agricultural extension pamphlets from the recycling bin in the backroom, documents produced by the state university system, written for working farmers, practical and specific in the way that academic writing rarely is. She left them on the table where Clara usually sat without drawing attention to them, the way you might quietly refill someone's coffee cup. Clara read in the evenings after chores at the kitchen table with the light on her notebook open beside whatever book she was working through. She read slowly the way you read when you are trying to understand something rather than simply get through it. She took notes in the margins when she was allowed to make copies of pages when she wasn't transferred the most important information into the notebook in her own words so that the understanding would be hers rather than borrowed. What she found over those first weeks of reading was that the question she had been carrying since the day in the South Field had an answer. Not a simple answer, not an easy one, but a real one grounded in science, in chemistry, in the specific biology of living soil. And it was an answer that rearranged everything she thought she understood about what was happening behind the south fence. The cane bagasse that the Meridian Company had been dumping on the Bowen land for 6 years was not in any fundamental sense garbage. It was raw material in the wrong form at the wrong stage without the right conditions to become what it was capable of becoming. Sugarcane bagasse was one of the most carbon-rich agricultural residues on Earth, dense with organic matter, full of the structural complexity that soil organisms need to do their work. In its raw form, dumped in volume without management, it was toxic to the soil it sat on, acidic, nitrogen-starved. It suppressed drainage, collapsed the root zone, leached compounds into the water table. She had lived the raw form. She knew exactly what it did, but the books described something else. Under the right conditions, the right balance of carbon and nitrogen, the right moisture, the right oxygen, the right microorganisms, the right time, that same material could become humus. True humus, the dark, crumbling, sweet-smelling substance that was the foundation of living soil, the thing that made the difference between ground that grew and ground that didn't, between topsoil that lasted and topsoil that blew away. Farmers had simpler names for it: finished compost, living fertilizer, the kind that didn't burn the soil the way synthetic nitrogen did, but rebuilt it season by season, year by year, in ways that compounded and deepened over time. The key was a ratio. She read about it in 3 different books before she fully understood it, and when she understood it, it unlocked something. Carbon to nitrogen. The magic number was approximately 30 to 1, 30 parts carbon for every 1 part nitrogen. That was the ratio at which the microbial communities responsible for decomposition could work at full efficiency, the ratio at which the pile generated enough heat to kill pathogens and weed seeds, the ratio at which organic matter broke down into something that fed the earth rather than depleting it. The bagasse sitting in those piles behind the south fence had a carbon to nitrogen ratio of approximately 150 to 1, 5 times higher than it needed to be. The carbon was there in abundance. That was never the problem. What the pile lacked was nitrogen. It was in the specific biological sense starving. Not enough nitrogen for the microorganisms to work, not enough biological activity to generate heat, not enough heat to accelerate breakdown, just mass, sitting in the heat and the rain breaking down in the slowest possible way, leaching what it had into the ground beneath it. Clara sat with this for a long time. She read about thermophilic bacteria, organisms that thrive at temperatures above 130 degrees Fahrenheit, that do the heavy work of rapid decomposition, that kill what needs killing in the pile and leave behind the building blocks of soil health. She read about the difference between anaerobic and aerobic decomposition, the difference between a pile that rots and one that transforms. She read about turning and aeration and moisture management, about the way a well-managed compost pile was not a container but a living system. It had a temperature, it had a pulse. You could feel the heat from a foot away when it was working right. One night, sitting at the kitchen table while her father slept in the room down the hall and her mother had gone to bed early with a headache, Clara read a sentence that stopped her. It was in one of the extension pamphlets written in the plain, practical language of agricultural education. It said, "The organisms that make compost are already present in healthy soil. What they need is not introduction, but invitation." She read it twice. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a while. The bagasse pile didn't need something added from outside the county or ordered from a catalog. It needed carbon and nitrogen brought into balance. It needed moisture managed. It needed oxygen. It needed the microorganisms that were already present in the native soil of the Bowen farm, organisms that had been there since Earl Bowen's time, since before that adapted to this specific land and its specific biology. The company hadn't been dumping waste behind her family's farm. They had been dumping raw material. They simply hadn't known it, or they hadn't cared. She did. She found the gig note on a Thursday in mid-October, 3 weeks into her reading. She had gone to the south section of the old dump site, the area that had been abandoned by the trucks years ago, the section where the tomato plant had been to collect a sample of the material for comparison. She wanted to see up close what years of weathering had done to the oldest bagasse, how it compared to the fresh material that was still being dumped in the new sections. She was working near the east corner of the old pile, pulling back layers of partially decomposed material with a trowel when she found it, a piece of paper folded twice the kind that had once been white but had gone to gray from moisture and time. She might have left it debris ended up in the dump site from the trucks and the wind, but something about its folded precision made her pick it up. She opened it carefully. The paper was fragile at the creases, and part of the right margin had gone to pulp, but the central section was still legible. It was a technical memorandum, typed dated November 2009, with the Meridian Cane Processing letterhead across the top. It was addressed to the facility operations manager from someone identified only by initials in the engineering department. Clara read it standing in the field. The memo described in the dry language of technical documentation a feasibility assessment of composting operations for facility bagasse byproduct. It outlined the carbon to nitrogen ratio problem she had just been reading about. It described the cost of bringing in nitrogen amendments to correct the ratio. It noted the potential market value of finished compost product at current regional commodity prices, and at the bottom in a section labeled Recommendation, it said the following: the cost differential between managed composting and current disposal methodology is estimated at $40 per ton in favor of disposal. Current disposal methodology recommended for continuation pending market price review. $40 a ton. That was the number. That was the margin by which the company had decided that dumping was preferable to composting. Not because they didn't know it was possible, not because they hadn't thought about it, because $40 a ton across the volume they were generating made the math work in the direction of dumping. They had known since 2009, since the year it started. Someone in an office somewhere had run the numbers, written a memo in dry technical language, and filed it away, and the trucks had kept coming. Clara folded the memo along its original creases. She put it in the inside pocket of her work jacket against her chest. She finished collecting her samples and walked back across the field without saying anything to anyone, because there was no one to say anything to. She put the memo in the boot box under her bed with the 14 unsent letters. Then she went back to work. She started building in October on a patch of ground behind the old equipment shed, shielded from the road by the shed itself and by a stand of cedar that had grown up along the property line over the years. The location was deliberate. She was not ready to explain what she was doing because she was not yet sure there was anything to explain. She was testing a hypothesis. She was trying something. If it didn't work, she wanted to have failed privately. The first pile was small, 4 feet across, 3 feet high. She built it the way the pamphlets described, working from the bottom up. A base layer of coarse woody material, broken cedar branches, the structural bottom that allowed air to move into the pile from underneath. Then a layer of bagasse, hauled from the old section of the dump site in a wheelbarrow her father hadn't used since the spring, 1 load at a time across the uneven ground. Then a thin layer of fresh manure from the chicken coop source of the nitrogen the pile needed, then a handful of dark soil from the woods at the edge of the property where the native biology was still intact, where the organisms she was trying to invite were living their ordinary invisible lives, then another layer of bagasse, another thin layer of manure, another handful of soil. She watered it. The pamphlet said the moisture should feel like a wrung-out sponge, not dripping, not dry. She took a handful and squeezed it hard. One drop fell. She moved on. For the first 8 days, nothing happened that she could detect. She checked the pile every morning, pressing her palm against the outer surface, finding nothing but cool, damp fiber. She told herself this was expected. She told herself the biology was moving at its own pace. She told herself patience was part of the process. On the 9th day, the pile was warm. Not dramatically warm, not enough to be certain, but warm in a way that was distinct from the temperature of the air around it, from the temperature of the ground. She pressed her palm flat against the side of the pile and felt it. On the 11th day, she pushed a long steel rod into the center of the pile, a fence stake she'd taken from the equipment shed, and left it there for 60 seconds. When she pulled it out, the metal was too hot to hold comfortably. She stood in the cold October morning with the rod in her hand and laughed. It was a short laugh, startled out of her, not planned. The kind of laugh that happens when something works, when you weren't completely sure it would, when evidence arrives to confirm what you have been hoping was true. The pile was alive. She had invited something into the material, and it had come. She went to school that day with dirt under her fingernails that she hadn't quite gotten out, and a quality of quiet around her that her friend Dina noticed. "You okay?" Dina asked at the lockers. "Fine," Clara said. "Good, actually." Dina looked at her for a moment, then let it go. Some things in people register as present, even when they can't be named. The first real setback came in November on a Wednesday night when a cold front came through without much warning, dropping the temperature by 30 degrees before morning. Clara went out at first light and found the outer layer of the pile frozen solid. The interior was still generating heat. The core temperature was high enough to resist the freeze, but the frozen shell was cutting off the oxygen the process needed, and she could feel the pile laboring when she pressed her hand into the softer section near the top. She worked for 2 hours before school. She pulled raked up straw from the corner of the equipment shed and packed it around the sides and across the top of the pile. Then she went to the storage area where her father kept the tarps found, the blue one she had seen him use only once in the last 3 years, and took it without asking, because asking would have required an explanation, and she wasn't ready for that yet. She weighted the edges with sections of old pipe and went to school with hay chaff in her hair. She turned the pile every 5 days, pulling the cooler outer material into the hot core, exposing fresh surface to the oxygen, keeping the biology moving. Her shoulders ached by December. Her hands cracked at the knuckles and bled into her work gloves on the colder mornings. She wrapped them with the medical tape her mother kept in the kitchen drawer and went out again. The second setback came in December, during a week of heavy snow that arrived earlier than the forecast and stayed longer than expected. The snow load on the tarp soaked through the outer layer of the pile before she caught it. When she turned the pile on the following Sunday, she smelled it before she got the pitchfork fully into the material. It was bad. Not the sweet, earthy smell of a pile working right, not even the neutral smell of fresh organic material. It was the specific, physical, unmistakable smell of anaerobic decomposition, the smell of a pile that has gone wrong in the interior where the oxygen has been driven out by excess moisture and the biology has shifted from the organisms she wanted to the ones she didn't. It was the smell of rot in its least productive form, and it hit her from 6 feet away and made her eyes water. She staggered back a step, put her sleeve over her nose, stood there for a moment, eyes watering in the gray December morning. Then she walked back in. She turned the whole pile, every layer working from outside to center, exposing the anaerobic sections to the air, trying to reintroduce the oxygen that would shift the biology back toward the organism she needed. The smell was bad enough that she had to stop twice and walk away and breathe. A thin, cold rain had started, which made everything worse in the specific way that cold December rain makes outdoor physical work worse, not dramatically, just steadily, persistently, adding its weight to everything. She rebuilt the pile in the rain. She restructured the drainage underneath it so water would move away from the base rather than pooling. She adjusted the proportions of the layers. She pulled additional coarse material from the cedar stand to improve the aeration structure. It was during this rebuilding in the gray early afternoon of a December Wednesday that she became aware of a vehicle on the old service road that ran along the east side of the property. It was a sound she had registered on the edge of her awareness without attending to it, just the distant sound of an engine, someone using the back road that connected the farm properties, nothing unusual. She was focused on what she was doing, and she didn't look up immediately. When she did look up, there was a dark truck parked at the gate where the service road met the back corner of the Bowen property. She couldn't see the driver clearly in the flat winter light. The engine was still running. The truck sat there for a moment long enough for her to register that it was stopped long enough for whoever was inside to see her standing in the rain beside the half-rebuilt pile, and then it pulled forward slowly and continued down the service road and was gone. She didn't know whose truck it was. She couldn't make out the plate at that distance in that light. She turned back to the pile and finished what she was doing. She thought about it later in a passing way. There was something in the quality of that stopped truck, the stillness of it, the duration before it moved on that lodged in her memory without being explicable. She filed it away without knowing what she was filing. The third setback arrived in January and came from a direction she hadn't anticipated. A boy in her class named Trey Barfield lived on the neighboring property's long access road, which meant he occasionally passed the Bowen farm on weekend mornings when he was heading to the feed co-op for his family. On a Saturday in early January, he came around the back of the equipment shed, whether by accident or by the specific curiosity that adolescent boys apply to things that seem like they might be interesting or embarrassing, and found Clara pushing a wheelbarrow of chicken manure across the frozen ground toward the pile. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. On Monday morning, Manure Girl had been written on her locker in black permanent marker in letters large enough that there was no pretending you hadn't seen it. The hallway had the specific quality of watching that hallways have when something social is being adjudicated. People in the vicinity doing the thing where they're not quite looking and absolutely looking. Clara stopped in front of her locker and read it. She did not feel the thing surge up in her that she might have expected. What she felt instead was something quieter and in some ways harder, a flat, clarifying recognition that this was the price of doing something that other people found strange and that the price was going to have to be paid. She opened her locker. She got her books. She went to class. She did not wipe the marker off the locker. It was there every morning for 2 weeks, and she walked past it every morning without adjusting her pace or her expression. By the third week, whoever had written it seemed to have lost interest in waiting for a reaction that was not going to come. By February, someone had put a sticker over part of it, and the rest had faded from repeated contact with other lockers. What she thought about walking past it in those 2 weeks was the tomato plant, dark-leaved, heavy-fruited, growing alone in the middle of ground where nothing else would grow. She thought about the specific quality of that plant's existence, not performing, not responding to anything external, just doing what it was built to do in the conditions available to it. She could do that. It was Mr. Gaines who gave her the book. She had been eating lunch alone one Thursday in late November. She did this sometimes when she needed quiet. sitting at the end of a table near the windows with a book or her notes, and he had come through the cafeteria on his way to the faculty room and seen what she was reading. It was one of the extension pamphlets from the library, a technical document on windrow composting methods, not the kind of thing a 16-year-old was typically found reading at lunch. He had stopped. He hadn't said anything for a moment. Then he had continued to the faculty room. Clara had watched him go in her peripheral vision, not directly. The next morning, there was a book on her desk in agriculture class. She arrived to find it there before the bell. It was a paperback, battered, the cover held on with a strip of clear tape that had yellowed at the edges. The title was An Agricultural Testament by Sir Albert Howard, published in 1940. The spine had been broken and rebroken so many times it moved freely in any direction. She opened the cover. There was no inscription, no note, just the book itself. At the end of class, as the room was clearing, Mr. Gaines said, without looking up from the papers on his desk, "Read it when you have time. No hurry." And then, after a pause of about 3 seconds, as she was almost to the door, "My barn has space, if you ever need more room than you've got." She didn't answer. She was out the door before she had quite processed what he'd said. She read the book in 2 sittings over the following weekend, sitting in the equipment shed, where it was slightly warmer than outside because the south wall collected sun in the afternoons. Howard's writing was old-fashioned in its rhythms, but clear in its thinking, the work of a man who had spent decades in the field working through problems that were practical and urgent, not theoretical. He wrote about the living quality of healthy soil with the specificity of someone who had watched it and measured it and understood it from the inside. She read it twice. She did not go to Mr. Gaines's barn, not yet. The work she was doing was hers private, and she was not ready to make it something shared. But she thought about what he'd said. She thought about the fact that he had said it at all. By February, she had 3 piles working at different stages behind the equipment shed. The first, rebuilt after the December disaster, had been running for nearly 2 months and was beginning to cool, a sign the book said that the most active phase of decomposition was slowing because it was nearing completion. The second pile was at peak temperature, hot enough to steam on cold mornings. The third she had started in January as the February test and experiment in adjusting the nitrogen ratio slightly higher to see whether it accelerated the early phase. She turned each one on a schedule she had worked out in her notebook, staggered so that she was turning 1 pile every other day rather than all 3 on the same day. Sunday was the day she turned the oldest pile, always alone, in whatever weather was available, while the sound of church bells carried across the flat farmland from the First Methodist in town 3 miles away. She had not been to church in 4 months. Her parents had stopped asking. In March, a Sunday morning with thin, cold light and mud soft under her boots, she opened the oldest pile along the top and pushed her hands into the material. It was different. It was completely, entirely different from anything she had started with. The texture was fine and uniform, the color a deep brown black that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. She crumbled a section between her palms, and it fell apart in the way that good soil falls apart, not in clumps, not in fibers, but in pieces that seemed to want to separate, that had a loose, aerated quality that the raw bagasse had never had. She pressed her face into the handful. The smell was earth, simple, complete, ancient earth, the smell of the forest floor after rain, of soil that is alive and working, not bagasse, not manure, not waste in any form. Earth, the honest smell of something that had completed a transformation. She stood there for a moment in the cold March morning with the smell of it in her nose and something moving through her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. Then she went to the shed and found a clean coffee can on the shelf, a 1-pound tin that had been sitting empty since the fall, and she filled it with the finished compost. She pressed the lid on carefully. She carried it inside and set it on the kitchen table in the center where her father would see it when he came in from the morning chores. She sat down and waited. Walt Bowen came in 20 minutes later, stomping mud from his boots in the doorway. He saw Clara sitting at the table and the coffee can between them, and he stopped. He crossed to the table and picked up the can. He looked at her. She said nothing. He opened the lid. He looked at what was inside. He reached in and took a handful and held it in his closed fist for a moment, and then he opened his hand and let it fall slowly back into the can, the way a man handles something he is trying to understand through touch. Then Walt Bowen sat down in the chair across from his daughter, and for the first time in Clara's 16 years of knowing him, she watched her father cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the silent movement of it across his face, the kind of crying that has been held back a long time and comes out quietly because the holding back has become a habit that doesn't fully release even when it finally breaks. He did not say anything. He did not need to. June appeared in the doorway from the bedroom hallway, drawn by the stillness that had a different quality than the ordinary stillness of that kitchen. She looked at Walt. She looked at Clara. She looked at the coffee can. Then she turned back toward the hallway without speaking. Clara sat across from her father in the March morning and let the silence be what it was. Outside, the equipment shed held two more piles at their various stages of transformation. The boot box under her bed held 14 unsent letters and one technical memo from 2009. The south field still carried the black mountain against the fence line still received. Its truck still held its poison ground where nothing grew except in one corner, the memory of a tomato plant that had known something before anyone else did. But in that kitchen with a coffee can, a finished compost on the table between a father and a daughter, something had shifted that could not be shifted back. Something had been made from what had seemed unmakeable. Something had been grown from what had been called waste. The work was not done. It was barely begun, but it was real and it was hers, and she had made it herself out of knowledge and time and the stubborn, patient willingness to keep turning the pile, even when the pile was wrong and the weather was cold and the marker on the locker said what it said. She would turn it again next Sunday, and the Sunday after that. The test plot was a 1/4 acre of ground on the northeast side of the farmhouse, a section that had been producing nothing useful for 2 full seasons. Sandy, tired, the kind of soil that had been worked too hard for too long without being given anything back, the kind of ground that grows weeds, because weeds are the only thing with the patience for it. Clara had chosen it deliberately. She wanted a fair test, not a favorable one. She wanted to know what the compost could do against real difficulty, not against ground that was already inclined to cooperate. She worked the finished compost in by hand and by hoe on an April morning when the air still carried the last edge of winter cool, turning it into the top 8 inches of soil, the way the books described, not just spreading it on the surface, but incorporating it, giving the biology somewhere to go. She used every pound of the finished batch from the oldest pile, and it covered the 1/4 acre in a layer that looked, when she was done, like she had laid dark velvet over tired ground. She planted sweet corn in rows, spaced exactly as the extension pamphlet specified. She planted pole beans along the eastern edge where they could climb without shading the corn. She planted 3 varieties of tomato, 2 she knew, and 1 she had ordered from a seed catalog, using money she had saved from a summer of odd jobs the previous year, a variety described as heavy-bearing and heat-tolerant, suited for southern conditions. Then she kept making compost. She had worked out over the winter months a production system that functioned with the efficiency of someone who has thought carefully about how to scale a small operation without external help. She had identified which sections of the old dump site yielded the best aged material, the southeast corner, where years of weather had already begun the breakdown process, where the bagasse had been sitting long enough that its carbon to nitrogen ratio had drifted somewhat closer to manageable. She had a turning schedule. She had a windrow, a long, low structure behind the equipment shed covered with the salvaged tarp that she turned every Sunday afternoon alone while the church bells carried their 3-mile message across the flat country. She was building towards something. She didn't use that word yet, even internally. She was still thinking in the language of seasons of batches of one plot and then the next, but the notebooks were filling with data that was accumulating its own argument, even if she hadn't yet made that argument to anyone but herself. June came the way June comes in Louisiana, suddenly entirely with the specific generosity of southern heat that turns reluctant ground into something else almost overnight. Clara was in the field on the first Tuesday of the month when she stopped working and looked at what was in front of her. The test plot did not look like the rest of the farm. It did not look like anything else she had seen on any farm she had visited in the county in the specific, measurable way that results sometimes exceed their own projections. The corn was waist-high in the first week of June. In the surrounding fields, the fields that had been getting the same sun and the same rain, the corn was knee-high at best or hadn't been planted at all because the ground hadn't been worth the seed investment. Her corn was a different color than what she was used to seeing, a deeper green that had a quality of saturation to it, the way photographs look when the contrast is turned up. The stalks were thick. They moved differently in the wind than thin stalks move, with more resistance, more authority. The tomato plants were what stopped her longest. The two familiar varieties had come in heavy, the way good tomatoes come in hanging low, requiring restaking before the end of May, bending the wire cages she had put around them. The new variety, the one from the catalog, was something she stood in front of for a full minute without moving. The leaves were the same deep color as the volunteer plant she had found in the south field the previous September. The stems were thick as her thumb at the base. The fruit was clustered in groups of 5 and 6, round and heavy, the kind of fruit that looks like a photograph of what a tomato is supposed to look like, rather than the actual thing. The pole beans had outgrown their support structure twice. She had restaked them with longer stakes, and they had outgrown those too, threading themselves up and over the top and beginning to cascade back down the other side in a way that was almost comic, as if the plant was making a point. She stood in the middle of the test plot in the June heat and understood with the specific quiet certainty that comes when evidence has accumulated past the point of doubt that the hypothesis had been correct, that the material behind the south fence was not waste, that the biology of transformation she had been reading about and attempting and rebuilding after failure was real, was scalable, was producing results that any farmer in the county could see with their own eyes if they walked to the fence and looked. She went back to work. She did not call anyone. She did not post anything or make any announcement. She just kept harvesting what was ready, tending what needed tending, and adding the next batch of finished compost to the next section of tired ground she had earmarked for treatment. The results, as results sometimes do, began to speak for themselves. Cormac Vass had been farming the 60 acres across the road from the Bowen property for 31 years. He was 65 years old, a large, quiet man with sun-damaged skin and the deliberate movements of someone whose body has accumulated several decades of physical work and learned to budget its effort accordingly. He had known the Bowen family since Walt was in his 20s. He had been to Earl's funeral. He had watched the dump site grow with the particular silence of a man who has decided that watching is what is available to him. On an afternoon in late July, Clara was picking beans along the eastern row of the test plot. The work was repetitive and physical, and she was moving through it at the steady pace she had developed for tasks that needed doing completely, not fast, not slow, just continuous. She had filled 2 baskets and started on a third when she became aware that she was being watched. She didn't look up immediately. She finished the section she was working on, moved to the next, and looked up in the direction of the road with the casual attention of someone checking their surroundings. Cormac Vass was leaning against the fence post at the edge of his property across the road, both forearms resting on the top rail, looking at the test plot with the focused attention of a man trying to understand something he is seeing. He had been there long enough for the stillness to have settled into him, the kind of settled stillness that happens when someone has stopped moving and started truly looking. She kept picking. 5 minutes passed, maybe more. She moved along the row, filling the basket, working in the shade of the beans that had grown tall enough now to create their own shade below them. "What are you putting on it?" Cormac called across the road. His voice had the quality of a man who has been waiting for the right moment to speak and has decided this is it. Not aggressive, not particularly friendly, just a practical question from a farmer looking at something a farmer wants to understand. Clara straightened up from the row. She looked at him across the road. She thought briefly about all the specific things she could say in this moment about the notebooks, about the months of reading about December, and the rain, and the anaerobic pile, and the marker on the locker. She thought about Patricia Rourke in the feed store, saying that's just how things are now. "Fertilizer I made," she said, "from the cane waste." A pause. "From where?" She pointed, not toward the equipment shed, not toward the test plot, across the south field, toward the black mountain behind the fence line. Cormac Vass looked in the direction she was pointing. Then he looked at the test plot. Then he looked back in the direction of the south field. He took his hat off, ran a hand through his hair, gray and sparse, the hair of a man who has worn a hat for 30 years, and put the hat back on. He pushed off the fence and walked back across his property without another word. 3 days later, he came back with 2 men Clara recognized from the farms to the south. All 3 of them stood at the fence for a while. Then Cormac knocked on the Bowen front door and asked Walt if they could take a look at the operation behind the equipment shed. Walt looked at Clara. Clara looked at Walt. "I'll show them," she said. She walked the 3 men through the windrow system behind the shed. She showed them the 3 stages of production: the fresh pile, the active pile steaming in the morning, cool, the finished batch that was almost ready for use. She showed them the materials, the aged bagasse from the southeast corner of the old dump site, the chicken manure, the native soil amendment. She showed them the turning method. She answered their questions in the plain, practical language of someone who has understood something from the inside and can explain it without performing. The 3 men listened. They did not say much. Cormac asked one technical question about the moisture management, a smart question, the kind that comes from someone who has been thinking about drainage problems, and she answered it directly. When she was done, they thanked her and left. She watched them walk back across the yard and out to their trucks. She watched Cormac say something to the other 2 men before they got in their vehicles. She couldn't hear what he said. She went back to work. Mr. Gaines arrived on a Saturday morning in September with a soil testing kit in a black carrying case and the expression of a man who has been waiting for the right moment to do something and has decided the moment has arrived. He explained at the door, spoken with a colleague in the Agricultural Sciences Department at LSU who had asked to see the data from any testing he managed to collect. He said this without making it sound like a larger thing than it was, in the way he had of presenting information practically. Clara showed him the 3 test sites. She walked him through the test plot on the northeast side of the farmhouse, the section of bottomland near the south fence that had been most directly affected by the dump site, and the oldest corner of the dump site itself. At each location, he took samples with the methodical care of someone who has done this for 23 years and knows exactly what he is doing and why. He went home with the samples. He came back the following Saturday. He sat at the kitchen table with Walt and June on one side and Clara on the other, and he put a folder on the table between them and opened it. He spoke quietly, without drama, in the manner of someone who believes the information can carry itself without assistance. The organic matter content of the test plot soil was nearly 3 times higher than comparable agricultural land in the county. The microbial activity measured by CO2, respiration rates, and enzyme activity levels was the highest he had recorded in 23 years of testing in this region. The soil structure had improved measurably in the short time since the compost had been incorporated, showing increased aggregate stability and water retention capacity. The bottomland, predictably, was still severely depleted, but even there, the data showed the beginnings of biological recovery in the sections closest to where Clara had been applying finished product along the fence line. What she was producing, he said, looking at Clara directly when he said it, and not looking away, was a complete organic soil amendment. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, micronutrients, and critically living biology, all of it derived from material that the Meridian Cane Processing Company had been paying to dispose of for 6 years. He paused. Then he placed a second sheet on the table. This was not test data. It was a printed document from the LSU Agricultural Extension Office, a current commodity pricing sheet for organic soil amendments in Louisiana and Texas markets. Finished compost from high-carbon agricultural residues, properly processed, properly certified, properly packaged, was selling at between $480 and $620 per ton at regional distribution. He let that number sit on the table for a moment. Then he said, based on his visual estimate and the samples he had taken from the dump site, the volume of raw material currently present on the Bowen property represented somewhere in the range of 2,200 tons. Properly managed through the composting process, that volume would yield, accounting for moisture loss and material reduction during decomposition, somewhere above 300 tons of finished product. He did not do the final multiplication out loud. He left the pricing sheet on the table. Walt picked it up. He looked at it. He put it down. He looked at Clara. She looked back at him. 300 tons at $500 per ton conservatively. The number was there on the table in the quiet Saturday morning kitchen, in the particular silence of a figure that is too large to take in quickly and too real to dismiss. $150,000 from material they had been living with for 6 years as a source of nothing but loss, from material that had poisoned the bottomland and fouled the water and bent her father's shoulders into the shape of a man who has stopped expecting things to come back the way they were, from the black mountain behind the fence line that the drivers had been dumping without looking at the house. June put her hand flat on the table. She didn't say anything. She just put her hand on the table. Mr. Gaines closed his folder. He said that a colleague at LSU was very interested in the production methodology. He said that there might be a graduate student who would want to spend some time studying the windrow system in the spring. He said he would leave the folder with them and they could look through the data at their own pace. Then he said what he had come to say, the thing underneath the data and the pricing sheets. What she's figured out here is not a small thing. I want to make sure you understand that. He said it to Walt, but his eyes moved to Clara when he finished saying it. He drove away at noon. The folder stayed on the table. Garrett Mills arrived on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of October. He was 34 years old, in a suit that fit him well, with the careful grooming of a man who has been taught that presentation is a form of argument. He carried a clipboard. He drove a company vehicle, dark blue clean. He had the practiced manner of someone who has been sent to have a specific conversation and has been briefed on how to have it. Clara was the one who came to the door. She had been expecting someone, not necessarily him, not necessarily this week, but someone. The logic of the situation had been building toward a contact from the company since Mr. Gaines had visited, since Cormac Vass had knocked on the door, since the article request had come in from the Regional Farming Journal, a small publication, not widely read, but read by the people who needed to read it. She had understood for several weeks that the information had passed the threshold beyond which it could be contained to the Bowen property. She looked at Garrett Mills standing on the front porch with his clipboard. He introduced himself. He gave his title, which was something in operations management with a regional scope. He said in the careful, calibrated language of someone who has been told to begin indirectly that the company was always interested in partnerships with local agricultural producers. He said that he understood the Bowen family had developed some interesting work with organic materials processing. He said that Meridian would be very open to a conversation about the materials currently stored on the adjacent property and what a mutually beneficial arrangement might look like going forward. He said mutually beneficial the way Leland Greer had said temporary, with the fluency of a phrase that has been chosen for its ability to mean several different things at once. Clara listened to all of it. She did not change her expression during any of it. She had thought in the months of difficult work about what she might say if someone from the company came to the door. She had composed in her mind various versions of the response, some pointed, some cold, some that contained the specific satisfaction of making someone account for what had been done. None of those imagined responses felt right standing here. They felt like performances designed for an audience that wasn't present. They felt like the wrong scale for the actual moment. She looked at Garrett Mills. She looked at his clipboard. "You can talk to my father," she said. "He's in the barn." She held the door for a moment, not inviting him in, simply indicating the direction. Then she stepped back from the doorway and let it close. She walked through the kitchen, put the kettle on, and sat down at the table. She could hear faintly the sound of footsteps crossing the yard toward the barn. She sat there while the kettle heated and looked at the folder Mr. Gaines had left still on the table, its edges worn from the times it had been picked up and set down over the past 2 weeks. She thought about the memo in the boot box under her bed, dated November 2009, with its $40 per ton margin and its clean technical language. She thought about 14 unsent letters in a shoebox. She thought about the cold December morning when she had pushed her hands into a pile that smelled like a slaughterhouse and decided to rebuild it from the bottom rather than abandon it. The kettle began to sound. She got up and made tea. She sat back down. Outside in the barn, her father was talking to a man from the company that had been dumping on their land for 6 years. She drank her tea. The following week brought the other visitor, the one she hadn't expected. It was a Tuesday evening, the light going flat and gold over the west fields, the temperature dropping in the way it drops in Louisiana in October, not with the hard authority of northern fall, but with a kind of suggestion, a loosening of the heat's grip. Clara was in the equipment shed doing the end-of-day checks when she heard a vehicle on the back road, the old service road along the east property line. She heard it stop. She heard a door. She heard footsteps on the gravel path that led to the back of the house. She came around the side of the shed and found Leland Greer standing at the back door. He was in his late 50s, heavier than she had imagined from hearing his voice through a window 2 years ago, dressed in the practical clothes of a man who is not at the office, jeans, a work jacket, boots that had seen actual mud. He did not have a clipboard. He did not have a company vehicle. He had driven his own truck, which she could see parked at the gate of the service road, an older model with a dent along the passenger side that had not been repaired. He knocked on the back door. Walt came out. The two men looked at each other in the fading October light. Walt held the door but did not open it wider. Leland Greer said, "I'm not here on behalf of the company." A pause. Walt said nothing. Leland said, "I drove past her in December, last year, on the service road." He stopped. He seemed to be measuring something, some internal accounting of what he owed the honesty of the moment. She was rebuilding that pile, in the rain, by herself. He looked past Walt's shoulder, not quite into the kitchen, just in the direction of the interior of the house. "I stopped," he said. "I watched her for a minute, and then I drove away." The evening was quiet enough that Clara, standing at the corner of the equipment shed, 20 feet away, could hear all of it. "I should have stopped longer," Leland said. "I should have." He seemed to reconsider the direction of the sentence. "I knew what was in that memo. I signed off on the decision in 2009. $40 a ton. It looked clean on a spreadsheet." He paused. "It didn't look like what it looked like from that service road." Walt Bowen looked at Leland Greer for a long time. Clara could not see her father's face from where she was standing. She could see his posture, the set of his shoulders, the weight of him in the doorway, and she had known that posture her entire life and could read it the way she read weather. Walt did not speak. He looked at Leland for long enough that the silence became a kind of answer in itself. Then he stepped back from the doorway, not inviting Leland in, just releasing the threshold, letting the moment have the space it needed. Leland Greer nodded once. He turned. He walked back across the yard to the gate of the service road. He got in his truck. He drove away. Clara stayed at the corner of the equipment shed until the sound of his engine faded. She stood in the cooling October air and looked at the back door, which Walt had let close quietly behind him. There was no victory in what had just happened. There was no verdict, no reckoning, no scene from a film where the wrongdoer confesses and the wrong party receives the satisfaction of the acknowledgement. There was only a man in his late 50s who had lived long enough to understand the difference between a clean spreadsheet and a cold December road, and who had driven out on a Tuesday evening in his own truck to say so to the man whose land he had helped damage. It was not enough. It was also not nothing, and it was, Clara understood, standing in that cooling yard, probably the most honest thing anyone from that company had ever offered her family. Not justice, not restitution, just one man's willingness to drive to the back door and say what was true without a clipboard, without a company representative, without the protection of institutional language. She went back into the shed and finished the evening checks. What followed was not a courtroom drama. There was no trial, no public reckoning, no moment in which the full weight of 6 years landed on the Meridian Cane Processing Company in a way that the county could witness. That was not how things of this kind resolved. Clara was coming to understand, not in the dramatic register of the stories people told about justice, but in the quieter register of negotiations and agreements and mutually beneficial arrangements, to use Garrett Mills's phrase, which turned out to mean exactly what she had suspected it meant. The company agreed to remediate the dump site at their own expense. It was written into the agreement as a cleanup commitment, not as an admission of harm, and the legal language around it was specific in the way legal language is specific when it is designed to permit something without conceding something. She read the agreement herself twice before Walt signed it. She understood most of it. The parts she didn't understand, she asked Mr. Gaines about, who asked his colleague at LSU, who explained them. She accepted a consulting arrangement, informal, modest, in its compensation, unnamed in the official documentation, under which she would provide guidance on the composting methodology to the company's new waste management program, the program that someone in their operations department had apparently been advocating for since a memo written in November 2009 had failed to make the economic case at $40 a ton and been filed away. The economics had changed. The price of organic soil amendments had increased significantly over the intervening years. What had not been worth doing at $40 a ton was worth doing now, and the Bowen farm had demonstrated not only that it was possible, but that it could produce results that a soil scientist at LSU was interested in studying. A graduate student named Prescott arrived in the spring. He was 26 years old, earnest, slightly awkward in the specific way of people who are more comfortable with data than with the social mechanics of being a guest on someone else's property. Clara showed him the windrow system with the same plain practicality she had shown Cormac Vass and his neighbors the previous summer. She answered his questions. She let him take samples and run his instruments and write things in his notebook. She did not perform any version of herself for his benefit. She just showed him the work. He stayed for 3 weeks. He left with a full data set and an invitation to return in the fall. He sent a copy of his preliminary findings before he drove back to Baton Rouge, a 10-page document that used language she mostly understood and that confirmed in the formal register of academic documentation what the test plot had already shown anyone willing to look at it. The Regional Farming Journal ran its article in early summer. It was small, a half-page with a photograph of the test plot and a 2-paragraph profile of Clara that focused on the methodology rather than on her specifically, which was how she preferred it. Walt cut it out of the journal and framed it in a simple wooden frame he made himself and hung it above the kitchen sink, where it was the first thing anyone saw when they stood at the window, looking out toward the south field. Clara looked at it sometimes when she was washing dishes. She did not feel looking at it what she might have expected to feel. She did not feel vindicated or satisfied in any complete sense. She felt mostly the particular steadiness of a person who has learned what they are capable of and is now simply engaged in the ongoing work of being capable of it. The bottomland took 4 more years. She had expected this. The books had been honest about remediation timelines for soil that had been subjected to sustained chemical disruption, and the bottomland had been subjected to 6 years of direct contact with raw bagasse and its leachate. You could not undo that in a single season of good compost, however good the compost was. The biology had to be rebuilt from the ground up, literally in the slow, patient manner of all real rebuilding, not added on top, but integrated, season by season, organism by organism, as the soil community re-established itself and the structure of the earth beneath it shifted back towards something that could hold life. She worked the bottomland through 4 growing seasons. She applied finished compost in the fall and let it work through the winter. She planted cover crops in the early spring and turned them under before they seeded. She monitored the soil chemistry with the testing kit Mr. Gaines had left behind, tracking the numbers as they moved slowly, then less slowly, then, with the gathering momentum of a system finding its balance. She adjusted her inputs based on what the data told her, the way Earl had adjusted his inputs based on what the land told him, by the specific knowledge of this particular piece of ground and its particular history and its particular needs. In the 5th year after she had spread the first batch of compost over the first 1/4 acre of tired ground, the bottomland was ready. She planted it in October, a fall planting of winter wheat that would overwinter and come up in March. She stood at the edge of the field on the morning she finished planting and looked at the prepared ground, dark loose with the texture she had come to recognize as healthy, the soil falling away from the tiller in the way that good soil falls in pieces that hold their shape briefly and then yield to gravity with a kind of ease that bad soil never has. She pressed her hand flat against it. The temperature was right. The moisture was right. She could feel through her palm the particular quality that living soil has, not warm exactly, but not inert either. Something present, something working. It was the quality that Earl had been describing on the porch steps when she was 8 years old and couldn't quite understand the words. She understood them now. By the time Clara Bowen was 23 years old, the bottomland that her grandfather had once called the Good Bottom was the richest agricultural soil within 50 miles of the county. This was not a claim she made about it. It was a finding from the 3rd visit of the LSU research team, published in an extension report that she received a copy of and put in the boot box under her bed alongside the 14 unsent letters and the 2009 technical memo. She kept the windrow system running behind the equipment shed. She had expanded it twice, once when 3 neighboring farms entered into informal supply agreements for finished compost, and once when the county agricultural extension office asked if they could bring a group of students for a working demonstration. She said yes to both in the practical way. She said yes to things that were straightforward without making them into more than they were. On quiet evenings when the light went flat and gold over the west fields and the swallows cut low across the pasture, in the particular way swallows move when the insects are up, she would sometimes lean against the fence at the edge of the bottom land and look at it, not with triumph, not with the specific emotion of someone reviewing a vindication, just with the attention of a person who knows a piece of ground well and finds the knowing itself to be something worth returning to. The George Washington Carver quote was still on the inside wall of the equipment shed, handwritten on a piece of cardboard she had tacked up during the second winter, when the work had been hard and the results had not yet arrived. The cardboard had gone soft at the edges with time, and the ink had faded to a gray that was almost the color of the shed wall behind it. You had to know it was there to find it. Anything will give up its secrets if you love it enough. The cane waste had given up everything it had, its carbon, its nitrogen, its dormant biology, its latent capacity for transformation. It had given up the secret that the technical memo had failed to act on, that the $40 spreadsheet had buried for 6 years, that had been sitting in the southeast corner of the old dump site waiting for someone to understand it. It had given it up, not because it was asked nicely, or because a company decided to be responsible, or because a regulator enforced a rule. It had given it up because a 16-year-old girl with a spiral notebook and cracked hands and a pitchfork had been willing to learn what it needed and give that to it over and over through December rain and January cold and the specific social cruelty of a marker on a locker until the transformation was complete. The land had given up its secrets too. The bottom land had given back what it knew once it was given the conditions in which the knowing could come back through. And the girl, the woman now at 23, with the same practical quietness and the same tendency to press her palm flat against the earth to read what was happening in it, had given up some of her own secrets in the process, though she would not have described it that way about herself. She would have said only that she had learned what she was capable of, that she had found out what happened when you decided at 16, with no resources and no support and no certainty of outcome, that the question was worth following all the way to its answer. She turned the windrow pile every Sunday, alone, in whatever weather was available. She had been doing it for 7 years, and she would do it again next Sunday and the Sunday after that. The world had eventually come to where she was standing. She had not moved from the spot.